Pain and suffering is constantly appreciated in the New Testament as a manifestation of love. It's ironically, but it is manifested that when somebody suffers, God's love is in action. That is the way the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians begins today. We have to remember also that Jesus himself severely reprehended Peter when he tried to make him abandon suffering. The perspective over suffering is a persistent fatigue, excessive working, chronic pain, permanent incapacity of doing things, margination, abandonment, continuous humiliation, permanent frustration. And all those things can blind us and make us forget those moments that come like Jesus' anguishes at Gethsemane, the highest moment of humanity in the Lord Jesus Christ suffering. All these sufferings put to test the manifested truth about love through the reality of suffering. Some people say suffering is redemptive, and we question ourselves, who has not ever suffered? We all suffer in different ways. See how is the world and the life of humanity. We come into the world and into existence amid cries, and sometimes those cries are cries of gladness, but we also live the world amid cries, and those are cries of sadness. Suffering cannot be avoided. Everybody, in one way or another, has and will suffer. And let me tell you what, I personally do not agree with that. I keep asking God, why that way? When I look at his cross, when I look at his crowning of thorns, when I look at his scourges and all the suffering he had, why that way, Lord? And I haven't found an answer to that. The only thing I know is that we all, one way or another, suffered. I have heard people telling me, oh, Father, no one has suffered like me. But everybody says the same. Everybody has their own story of suffering, all the complications of life. And then they start to tell their story, and I say, you know what? I think you don't suffer. I remember this deacon who was always complaining about his sufferings, and he was really suffering. He, for some reasons, was diagnosed with leprosy. And because of the leprosy, he lost the sensibility in both of his hands and his feet. You know, the foot were totally with no sensibility, so he had no feelings. So he would take a hot pot. When he was cooking, he wouldn't even notice and be burned, and he wouldn't even feel it. And because of that, he constantly suffered injuries. He would be cutting onions, meat, whatever it is, and he would cut his finger, and he wouldn't even notice until he saw the blood. As I was telling you, because of that, he started to suffer a lot of infections, and his fingers started to be cut and cut and cut, little by little, little by little. So the poor guy was always like this, half fingers. He got to the point that when he wanted to serve on the altar, he wasn't able to hold the paten or the chalice to help us. And he was always telling me, Father, if you knew my story, when I was a child, my father died. And he was always whining, morning. Well, one day he came to visit me to one of my parishes in Oregon, and he saw a young guy from Central America, El Salvador, who was born with muscle dystrophy. That means his muscles would never work. His grandmom brought him all the way from El Salvador to the United States walking. And they crossed the border. And she says when they crossed the border, an immigration officer came and got them. And she saw the mom suffering with the boy and says, you know what? I didn't see you. Keep going. I understand that little boy right now graduated from high school. He doesn't speak, but he understands both English and Spanish. He can't even walk because he cannot hold his body. And he right now is feeding through the stomach because he cannot swallow because his muscles don't work. So he gets shocked every time he tries to get food. Well, when he was a teenager, he used to go to my church. You know, his grandparents take him to my church. And so he asked to have to receive First Communion. And we gave him First Communion. He says, I want also to receive confirmation. And we confirmed him. And he would go to confessions just with signs. He would say, no communion. He says, why? Why does he doesn't want communion? And he would, that was the sign, I committed sin. And he would go to confession. When that deacon saw that guy suffering, he says, you know what, Father? I don't suffer. Looking at that guy, then I see the suffering, the reality of suffering. I says, you know, David, I always think myself that when we wind out our sufferings, when we see others' sufferings, then we just come to the conclusion that we are in heaven or in paradise compared with some other people who really suffer. Still we suffer. St. Paul teaches that Christians can and must imitate the Lord's disposition in front of pain. Will it come to us one day? Well, we have already experienced. I remember when I was in an office doctor and I was waiting for some appointment, something like that. This was in Canada. I was just reflecting about that. The only thing I heard from the inside office to the waiting room was a lot of crying from a little boy or girl. I didn't remember that. It was, no, I don't want it, I said, oh my goodness, what's going on inside there? And then I start to reflect, was I like that when I was a kid and then they took me to the doctor? Sometimes we forget about our pains and our sufferings when we were kids. You know what was happening? They were just jabbing the little boy, you know, with an injection. But he saw that, and so he was so afraid that he was making more noise than the suffering he had. And then he came out, and he was, oh, poor little angel, you know, they made you suffer a little bit. But anyway, that's for your own good. And I was reflecting, sometimes God makes us suffer for our own good. He hurts himself when we suffer, but sometimes it may be necessary for our own good and for our salvation. How do we get favors from God to stop suffering? That's impossible. We need to get the strength from Him and the courage to confront. Remember, Jesus Christ demanded suffering to reach the kingdom of heaven. Take up your cross and follow me. Take up your cross and follow me.